My name is David McAllister, and what I'm about to tell you isn't the story of a hero. In fact, some would call me a villain, but in my mind, I'm neither. I'm just a man who's been wronged, and I'm doing what needs to be done to right those wrongs. I was never a bad person, at least not at heart. But sometimes life has a way of pushing people past their breaking point, and when it does, you'll find that vengeance can become the only thing that keeps you moving. I wasn't always this way. A few years ago, I was a regular guy living in a small town in Ohio. I had a family, a job, and a pretty decent life. Things were simple, almost too simple, but I didn't mind. I didn't need much to be happy. That was until Caleb Foster came into my life. Caleb was a man who prided himself on being a self-made success, a businessman with power and influence in the city. He had it all, money, respect, and a reputation for getting things done. But he also had a darker side, a side I wasn't aware of until it was too late. It all started with a single phone call, a call that should have never come. Caleb had approached me with a business deal, an opportunity that I couldn't turn down. He spoke about promises of wealth, a future for my family, and a life that would take us beyond the monotony of everyday existence. Who could resist? But what I didn't know was that behind those promises, Caleb had other plans. He wasn't just making a business deal, he was making a deal with the devil. That phone call led to an agreement that I now wish I had never entered. Caleb had made me an accomplice in a scheme, one that I later found out had ruined the lives of countless people. He was a manipulator, a man who used people like pawns, and I was no different. The weight of my involvement sank in as I saw the consequences of his actions. I watched as families lost everything. People lost their homes, their livelihoods, and in some cases their lives. But it wasn't just the destruction of others that stung. It was the betrayal. Caleb had used me, manipulated me, into being a part of something far worse than I could have imagined. And when the truth came to light, he had no problem turning his back on me. It was as if I had never existed to him. He left me to face the repercussions alone, leaving me with nothing but anger and a thirst for revenge. That's when I decided something had to change. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not again. Not while I was still breathing. I've spent the last 2 years preparing for this moment. I've learned things I never thought I'd need to know, made connections I never thought I'd have to make, and I've trained myself to be someone who won't hesitate. The old David McAllister is gone. There's only one thing on my mind now, and that's making Caleb Foster pay for what he did, for what he took from me, and for what he's done to countless others. So here I am standing at the edge of a path I can't turn away from. I know what's at stake. Revenge isn't just about settling scores, it's about justice. And this time, I'm the one who's going to deliver it. This journey isn't going to be easy, but I've made peace with that. The pain, the loss, the sleepless nights, they all brought me here, to this moment. And there's no turning back. It was time to put my plan into motion. I had spent the last 2 years thinking about every detail, analyzing every angle, and waiting for the right moment. The day Caleb Foster's name came up again in my life, I knew it was time. No more waiting, no more hesitating. I couldn't afford to waste any more time on plans that never moved beyond the drawing board. This was my chance, and I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers. I started by researching Caleb's every move, every decision. I knew that the most dangerous man is one who can predict what his enemy will do next. But Caleb had never faced someone who knew him as well as I did. I wasn't just going to be another target. I was going to be a shadow, silent, unseen, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I began by attending every event he was associated with: business meetings, charity functions, and even social gatherings. I couldn't afford to miss any opportunity to get closer to him, to learn more about his habits, his weaknesses, and how he surrounded himself with people who would do anything to protect him. In this world, Trust is the most valuable commodity, and Caleb's trust. It was his weakness. The first step in executing my plan was gaining access to his inner circle. This was no easy feat. Caleb's network of associates and bodyguards was like a fortress. But I had one advantage. People always underestimate the power of patience. I watched his employees, his associates, and his business partners for months, making mental notes of who was loyal to him and who could be bought. I wasn't looking for a direct approach. I needed to plant a seed of doubt. I knew that if I could turn a few of his trusted people against him, the rest would follow. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. I started with one of his most trusted employees, Gregory Thompson, a man who had been with Caleb for over a decade. Gregory was a former Marine who had served in combat, and he had the kind of loyalty that Caleb relied on. But I knew better than to take that loyalty at face value. People can be bought, and Gregory was no exception. I began by running into him at a bar. It wasn't a coincidence. I made sure to time it perfectly. The idea was simple: strike up a conversation, make a few casual comments, and let him see that I wasn't some random stranger. I needed him to know that I knew things that could turn his world upside down. So I dropped a few hints about Caleb's shady dealings, the things that didn't quite add up. And as expected, Gregory was curious. It didn't take long before he started asking questions. At first, he tried to dismiss my insinuations, but I could tell I was getting under his skin. I wasn't trying to convince him outright. I was planting doubt. And doubt is like a cancer once it takes root. It grows and it doesn't stop until it has consumed everything. Gregory didn't see it at first, but over the next few months I kept feeding him more information, slowly pulling him in. Eventually, he started to see what I was doing. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about justice, about Caleb's betrayal. And with that realization, Gregory became an ally. It wasn't just about Gregory, though. I needed to build a network, a small but effective group of people who could help me bring Caleb down. I didn't need to take on Caleb alone. I just needed the right people in the right places. I began reaching out to others who had been wronged by Caleb, who had seen firsthand how ruthless he could be. Together, we would build a plan that would make sure Caleb's empire came crashing down. My next move was to get my hands on some solid leverage. I knew Caleb had been involved in a number of illegal activities, money laundering, tax evasion, even some shady business with criminal organizations. But to bring him down, I needed evidence. I started working with a hacker, a guy named Zach, who was as skilled as they come when it came to breaking into secure networks and databases. Zach was cautious, but he was also hungry for the kind of payback that Caleb had left in his wake. After a few weeks of negotiating, I had a deal. We dug into Caleb's financial records, his emails, his phone logs, and what we found was far more than I could have hoped for. Caleb had been laundering money through offshore accounts, and some of the people involved in his operations were connected to dangerous criminal syndicates. The evidence was damning. It was the kind of material that could ruin Caleb's entire empire in a matter of days. I now had the leverage I needed, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment to strike. But even with the evidence in my hands, I knew I couldn't rush things. Timing was everything. I needed to make Caleb believe he was still in control, that he was invincible, that he had no idea I was out there plotting against him. The key to bringing him down was to stay hidden in the shadows, to make him feel like nothing could touch him until it was too late. The first real test of my plan came when Caleb made an unexpected move. He was no longer just a man with power. He was becoming a target, whether he realized it or not. I had been waiting for the right opportunity, and it finally arrived during one of his high-profile charity events. These events were his playground, a place where he could flex his muscles, show off his wealth, and maintain his carefully curated public image. But beneath the surface, it was also a place where people like him made enemies without even realizing it. I had been following Caleb for months, studying his routines, observing his interactions with others. I knew where he'd be when he'd be there, and who would be with him. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't even luck. It was careful planning, and I was about to make my first move. The charity event was being held at an upscale hotel downtown. Caleb had invited all of his high-profile clients, business partners, and local politicians, a gathering of the city's most powerful people. It was the perfect place for me to get in close to make a lasting impression without raising any suspicion. But I had to be cautious. I couldn't let anyone know I was there for anything other than a casual connection. My goal wasn't to make an immediate strike, it was to begin the psychological war. I entered the hotel lobby and scanned the room. There he was, standing in the middle of a crowd, surrounded by his loyal followers, the people who had helped him build his empire. He stood tall, confident, smiling and laughing as if he was untouchable. But I knew better. His smile was just a mask, one that couldn't hide the guilt and fear that simmered beneath the surface. I walked past him at first, making sure to avoid eye contact. I didn't want to be noticed yet. I needed to blend in to make Caleb think I was just another face in the crowd. But as I passed him, I dropped a piece of paper on the floor, something that would grab his attention. A simple note, nothing too overt, just a small hint of what was to come. It wasn't a direct threat, but it was a reminder. I wanted him to start questioning everything, to wonder who was watching him. The note was a cryptic message, one that Caleb would immediately recognize. It was a line from an old proverb, something he had once mentioned in passing when we first met. When the owl hunts, the dove is never safe. It was a message only he would understand, a reminder of the power he thought he had, and how it could slip away in an instant. I didn't need to explain anything. The message was clear. Caleb had a choice to make, and it was a choice he would have to make soon. As I walked away, I could see him scanning the crowd, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. But I didn't stick around to watch his reaction. I didn't need to. I knew that the seed had been planted. Doubt had been introduced, and Caleb wasn't the type of man to ignore a challenge. He would investigate, he would search for answers, and he would eventually come to realize that someone was after him. The question was, would he be able to figure out who it was before it was too late? The first encounter was a small victory, but it was an important one. It wasn't about causing a scene or making an immediate impact. It was about showing Caleb that he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. It was about getting into his mind, planting a seed of paranoia, and making him feel vulnerable. The next few days would be crucial. I would need to keep him off balance, keep him guessing, and most importantly, keep him focused on me. The more he focused on me, the less he would focus on the things that mattered, the things that would ultimately bring him down. The next phase of the plan would require a bit more finesse. I had to be strategic in how I approached the people around Caleb. It wasn't just about going after him directly, it was about manipulating the people he trusted, getting them to see him for what he truly was. Caleb had built his empire on lies and manipulation, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. I reached out to Lena Harrington, one of Caleb's closest business partners. Lena was smart, ambitious, and had a deep understanding of Caleb's operations. She wasn't as loyal as she appeared. In fact, I had reason to believe that she was starting to see Caleb for the manipulative man he truly was. My job was to push her in the right direction, to make her realize that aligning with Caleb was no longer in her best interest. I met Lena at a cafe on the outskirts of town. The moment I walked in, I saw her sitting at a corner table, her eyes scanning the room nervously. She had no idea who I was, but I knew she'd recognize the connection once we started talking. I sat down across from her, smiled and made small talk. Nothing too heavy, nothing too obvious, just a casual conversation. But as the minutes passed, I started to drop the same kind of hints I had with Gregory. I wanted Lena to question Caleb's loyalty, to wonder if he had been using her the same way he had used so many others. It wasn't hard. All I had to do was plant a few seeds of doubt, and I knew she would start to connect the dots. By the time we finished our coffee, Lena was already asking questions about Caleb, his past, and the people he had hurt. I could see the wheels turning in her mind. I knew that in time she would come around, but I wasn't in a hurry. The more she doubted Caleb, the more she would start to see him for who he really was, a monster who had used her, just like he had used me. The first encounter, the note, the conversation with Lena, it was all part of the bigger plan. A plan that would take time, patience, and careful manipulation. But with every step, I was closer to my goal. Caleb Foster was about to learn what it felt like to be hunted. The more I delved into Caleb Foster's world, the more I realized that to truly bring him down, I couldn't do it alone. Revenge, as much as it may feel like a personal mission, requires strategy, influence, and most importantly, the right people. Caleb had built an empire on deceit, manipulation, and loyalty that wasn't as firm as he thought. It was time for me to exploit his weakest link, the people closest to him. I started by reaching out to others who had been burned by Caleb. Some were former employees, others had been business partners or associates who had been discarded once they had outlived their usefulness. These people, like me, had felt the sting of betrayal, and now they were the key to breaking down the walls of Caleb's fortress. If I could gain their trust, they could help me infiltrate Caleb's world from the inside, providing the leverage I needed to topple him. One of the first people I turned to was Aaron West, a former executive at Caleb's real estate company. Aaron had been with Caleb for over a decade, but when Caleb no longer had any use for him, he was thrown out like garbage. I knew Aaron was bitter, and I knew that he would be willing to listen. I met him in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. It was a neutral space, a place where we wouldn't be seen by anyone who might know Caleb. Aaron was cautious at first, understandably so. He wasn't the type of guy to trust easily, especially after what Caleb had done to him. But I was patient. I didn't push him. I let the conversation flow naturally, slowly, steering it toward Caleb and his actions. It didn't take long for Aaron to start opening up, revealing the dark side of Caleb's empire, the crooked deals, the underhanded tactics, and the lies that had kept it all together. Aaron had seen it firsthand, and his bitterness was palpable. He didn't need much convincing. He already knew that Caleb was a man who used others for his own gain, and he was more than ready to bring him down. I promised Aaron that we would bring Caleb to justice, but I also made it clear that he couldn't just stand on the sidelines. He had to be involved. He had to be part of the plan. And so Aaron became one of my first allies. With his inside knowledge and experience with Caleb's operations, he was an invaluable asset. Next, I reached out to Hannah Carter, a former lawyer who had worked for Caleb's company. Hannah had been with Caleb for years, handling all of his legal matters, making sure his business dealings stayed above board. Or so she thought. But when Caleb's empire began to crumble, she realized how deep his corruption ran. Like Aaron, she was looking for a way to get out from under his thumb. When I contacted her, she was skeptical at first, unsure whether I was someone she could trust. But I had one thing that made her listen: evidence. I didn't need to tell Hannah about the things Caleb had done. She already knew. But what I did have was proof. Proof that Caleb had been involved in money laundering, tax evasion, and even criminal activities that she had unknowingly facilitated. I knew that once I showed her the evidence, there would be no turning back for her. She had to make a choice: stay loyal to a man who had used her, or join the fight to bring him down. When I showed her the proof, I could see the shock in her eyes. She was stunned by the extent of Caleb's deceit. But as I expected, she wasn't the type to back down from a fight. Hannah agreed to help me using her legal expertise to help us gather more evidence and build a case that would be impossible for Caleb to escape. She wasn't doing it for revenge. She was doing it for justice. Like me, she wanted Caleb to pay for what he had done. With Aaron and Hannah on my side, I had the beginning of a team, but I needed more. I needed to build a network of people who had suffered at Caleb's hands, people who were willing to fight back. I didn't want anyone who was in it for the money or the glory. I wanted people who had a personal stake in this, who knew the true cost of betrayal. I began looking for others who had fallen victim to Caleb's manipulation. There was Raphael, a small-time businessman whose company Caleb had bought out and run into the ground. Raphael's story was one of desperation and loss, and he had nothing left to lose. He was an easy recruit. He wanted revenge, just like me. Then there was Nina, a former employee of Caleb's who had been passed over for a promotion she rightfully deserved. Nina had worked tirelessly for Caleb, only to be shoved aside when he decided she wasn't useful anymore. She had been humiliated in front of her peers, and that humiliation had stayed with her. Nina wasn't just looking for revenge, she was looking to reclaim her dignity. Each person I brought into this mission had their own reasons for wanting to take Caleb down. Some were driven by betrayal, others by greed, and some like me by a sense of justice. Together we formed a coalition of people who wanted to see Caleb Foster fall. Our plan wasn't just about taking him out of the business world. It was about exposing him for the fraud, liar, and manipulator that he truly was. It was about taking away everything that mattered to him and showing the world who he really was. But with every ally I gained, the risk grew. Caleb wasn't an idiot. He would start to suspect something. The more people I brought into the fold, the more dangerous it became. I had to be careful. We couldn't afford any slip-ups, any mistakes. Every move we made had to be calculated, and every person involved had to be loyal. One betrayal, one leak, and Caleb would be able to fight back in ways we couldn't imagine. But for now, with Aaron, Hannah, Raphael, and Nina by my side, I knew we had a chance. Together, we would bring Caleb down, slowly, methodically, and with the precision of a well-oiled machine. No one could stop us now. At this point, things were starting to fall into place. Caleb Foster, once a figure I'd feared and admired in some twisted way, was now just a target. But I hadn't anticipated how deep his corruption ran, or how many layers there were to the monster I was hunting. It wasn't until I began uncovering more about Caleb's past, not just his business dealings, but his personal life, that I realized the true extent of the enemy I was facing. The information we had gathered from our various sources was invaluable. It showed Caleb as a master manipulator, a man who had used and discarded people without a second thought. But what I didn't know was how involved Caleb had been in something far darker than I could have imagined. As I dug deeper into his past, I started uncovering connections to dangerous criminal organizations, groups whose tentacles reached far beyond the business world Caleb had built. His ties were not just about money laundering and shady deals. They ran deep into organized crime, human trafficking, and even violent syndicates that dealt in fear and intimidation. One of the most shocking revelations came when we managed to gain access to Caleb's personal files, which had been locked away in his private office for years. They're hidden behind layers of encryption and security were documents linking him to multiple unsolved crimes, some dating back decades. Caleb wasn't just a businessman, he was a criminal mastermind, and his empire was built on blood and fear. These weren't just mistakes or missteps in business. These were intentional acts of malice crimes that had been carefully covered up. I remember the moment I first saw the file. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was sitting in front of my laptop going over the data we had gathered. Aaron had just come back from another meeting with a contact who had information about Caleb's offshore accounts. Hannah was busy reviewing legal loopholes to ensure that we had all the evidence we needed to bring him down. But as I scrolled through the document, a name caught my eye: Victor Langdon. Victor Langdon was a name I knew all too well. He was a notorious figure in the underground world, a criminal who had made his fortune by trafficking women across international borders. I had heard whispers of him during my time investigating Caleb's operations, but I had never connected the dots. It turns out that Caleb had been working with Langdon for years, moving money laundering it through shell companies, and even dealing in human trafficking. I sat there frozen as the realization hit me. Caleb wasn't just a man who ruined lives through business deals. He was a part of a larger, far more terrifying network. I immediately called Hannah. She was just as stunned as I was, but she quickly went to work cross-referencing the information I had found with the legal files and databases she had access to. As we pieced the puzzle together, the extent of Caleb's involvement in criminal activities became clearer. He wasn't just a businessman who had crossed some moral lines. He was a man who had sold his soul to the highest bidder, someone who had willingly chosen to betray anyone and everyone who crossed his path. But there was one more piece of the puzzle I needed to uncover. Caleb had always maintained a squeaky clean image in the public eye, but I knew it was all an act. The world didn't know what he was really capable of. That's where my next move came in. I reached out to an old contact, someone who had once worked for Caleb as a private investigator. This man, Mark Benson, had been hired by Caleb to dig up dirt on his competitors to find ways to leverage the personal secrets of anyone who might pose a threat to him. I knew Mark would be reluctant to talk at first, but he had a price, and after some negotiation, I had what I needed. Mark revealed that Caleb had not only orchestrated smear campaigns against his rivals, but had also gone so far as to destroy their reputations by fabricating evidence and planting false accusations. He had used Mark to dig into personal files, hacking into private emails, and using blackmail as a tool to ensure his dominance. The depths of Caleb's depravity were beginning to make sense now. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a puppet master pulling strings from the shadows, using people as tools to further his agenda. But what truly made my blood boil was the discovery of Caleb's direct involvement in orchestrating a series of violent attacks against people who had opposed him. These attacks were brutal, calculated, and executed with precision. There were disappearances, car accidents, and even people being found dead under suspicious circumstances, all tied back to Caleb's actions. He had done everything in his power to eliminate threats to his empire, even if it meant going to extreme lengths. The true enemy I was facing wasn't just the man who had betrayed me, the man who had ruined so many lives for his own gain. Caleb Foster was a monster, a man whose thirst for power and control had led him to commit unspeakable acts. This wasn't just a case of vengeance anymore. It had become a mission to stop a man who was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. If I didn't take him down now, if I didn't act quickly, he would continue to wreak havoc on the lives of anyone who dared to cross him. As the days passed, I found myself becoming more and more consumed with the mission. The lines between justice and revenge began to blur. I wasn't sure anymore if I was doing this for the people Caleb had hurt, or for the satisfaction of finally seeing him fall. But at that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that Caleb Foster's empire was built on lies, blood, and deceit, and it was time for it to come crashing down. I was going to be the one to make sure of that. The closer I got to bringing Caleb Foster down, the more I realized just how much of a toll this was taking on me and on those around me. When I first started this mission, I thought it would be straightforward: gather evidence, gain allies, and bring Caleb to justice. But the deeper I got, the more complicated things became. The game I was playing wasn't just about revenge anymore. It had become a game of survival. The first major betrayal came from someone I thought I could trust completely: Aaron West. Aaron had been one of my first allies, a man I considered a friend. Together we had planned Caleb's downfall, and I relied on Aaron's knowledge of Caleb's operations to guide our strategy. I had no reason to doubt him. until I found out I had made a critical mistake. Aaron wasn't loyal to me. He had been playing both sides the entire time. It happened the night before we were set to make our move. We had gathered all the evidence we needed to take Caleb down the money laundering, the connections to criminal syndicates, and the personal files implicating him in a series of unsolved crimes. The plan was simple. We would present everything to the authorities and watch as Caleb's empire crumbled. But as I was finalizing our plan with Hannah and Nina, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was a blocked number, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end was low, shaky, almost fearful. "You need to be careful," the voice warned. "Aaron's planning something. He's going to sell you out." At first, I didn't believe it. I thought it was just paranoia, the fear that comes with the territory when you're this deep into something as dangerous as this. But as the days went on, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Aaron was acting strangely. He was more distant, less engaged in the meetings we held. And when I confronted him about it, he brushed it off, saying he was just under stress. But I knew something was off. I had spent enough time with him to know when he was lying. The truth came out when I discovered that Aaron had been in contact with Caleb's inner circle behind my back. It was a moment that shattered everything I thought I knew. Aaron had been feeding Caleb information, warning him about our moves, and even sabotaging our efforts to gather evidence. He had made a deal with Caleb, a deal that promised him protection and a share of the spoils once Caleb regained control. The betrayal was so deep, so calculated, that it made my blood run cold. I didn't confront Aaron immediately. I couldn't. I had to think. I had to make sure that I didn't fall into the trap he had set for me. If I acted out of anger, if I let my emotions cloud my judgment, Caleb would win. That was the last thing I wanted. So I kept my distance, biding my time watching Aaron, closely knowing that the next move I made would be crucial. In the meantime, things started to unravel within our small group. People who had once been fully committed to bringing Caleb down began to question the risks involved. Nina the lawyer became more hesitant. She had always been motivated by a sense of justice, but the weight of everything we were doing was starting to wear on her. She wasn't sure if we could win this fight anymore, and she was beginning to question whether Caleb would truly be brought to justice. I tried to reassure her, telling her that we had come too far to back out now. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder if the entire mission had become too big, too dangerous for anyone to handle. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. Caleb's empire was massive, and if we failed, we wouldn't just be risking our lives. We would be risking everything we had worked for. The moment of truth came when I was forced to make a decision. Aaron had set a trap for me, one that he believed would be the end of our mission. He had planned to tip Caleb off about our meeting with the authorities. If I had walked into that meeting, we would have been caught, and Caleb would have escaped once again. But I wasn't stupid. I had seen it coming. At the last minute, I changed the location of our meeting. Instead of going to the hotel where we had arranged to meet the authorities, I took our team to a safer location, one that Aaron wouldn't be able to reach. I knew this would be the moment that decided everything. If we could get the evidence to the right people, Caleb would have no choice but to face the consequences. If we couldn't, we would all go down together. The meeting went smoothly despite the looming danger. We presented everything we had, and the authorities took it seriously. They promised to launch an investigation into Caleb's activities. But I knew that Caleb wouldn't go down without a fight. He had resources, connections, and the kind of power that could make things disappear. I couldn't let my guard down, not yet. After the meeting, I confronted Aaron. There was no hiding the truth anymore. He had sold us out, and now there was no place for him in the fight against Caleb. He had chosen his side, and it wasn't mine. I told him to get out of the city, to leave and never look back. He begged for forgiveness, promised that he had only been trying to protect himself, but I knew better. There was no redemption for him. He was no longer part of this. As Aaron walked away, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. He had betrayed me, But now I was free to finish what I had started. No more distractions, no more people to worry about. It was just me, my allies, and Caleb Foster. The final showdown was coming, and this time I would make sure Caleb didn't walk away. With Aaron out of the picture and our plan now on the verge of execution, I felt both a sense of relief and the weight of what lay ahead. The truth was, though, that the hardest part was still to come. Caleb was no fool. He had already caught wind of something happening, and I knew he wouldn't just let his empire crumble without a fight. In fact, the stakes had never been higher, and I could sense the tension in the air. At this point, everything I had done up until now was about to be put to the test. The network I had built, the evidence we had collected, and the sacrifices we had all made were now on the line. Caleb was ruthless, and I was about to see just how far he would go to protect his power and reputation. The time for subtlety had passed. It was no longer about playing in the shadows. It was about confronting him head-on. Caleb's reaction to the authorities' involvement was swift. The moment our evidence hit the public eye, it didn't take long for him to launch a counterattack. He moved quickly, using his resources to cover his tracks, discredit anyone who stood in his way, and manipulate the press into painting him as the victim of a smear campaign. But it wasn't just his public image he had to worry about. Caleb was also preparing for a more direct assault, one that would make all of us regret ever crossing him. It became clear that the more pressure we applied, the more Caleb would fight back. He wasn't just going to roll over. He had an army of lawyers, private investigators, and mercenaries at his disposal. I had expected some resistance, but I hadn't anticipated how aggressive his countermeasures would be. I remember the first time I realized how deep Caleb's reach really was. It wasn't just about his business dealings or criminal connections anymore. He had begun using his power to intimidate anyone who was involved in the investigation. I found out through one of my contacts that Hannah had received a threatening phone call warning her to stay out of it, or else she would lose everything. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't an empty threat. People had already started disappearing, and I knew that if we weren't careful, we would be next. In the face of this mounting danger, I knew I had to act. I couldn't just sit back and wait for Caleb to make his move. I had to take control of the situation. But I wasn't just going to play defense. I needed to be proactive. Caleb had underestimated me, and I wasn't about to let him get the better of me again. The first step was to double down on our strategy. I began gathering more information, moving in ways Caleb wouldn't expect, and making sure that we always stayed one step ahead. With Nina and Raphael on my side, we decided to go deeper into Caleb's inner circle. The goal was to find more weaknesses, more secrets that would break him even if they were buried in his most trusted allies. Nina had a few tricks up her sleeve, and Raphael had connections with people who had once worked directly for Caleb. Together we started piecing together the missing parts of his empire. We found more evidence of fraudulent activities, bribery, and even more ties to organized crime. The more we dug, the more I realized that Caleb was a man who had built his entire life on lies. Every relationship, every business deal, and every step he had taken was part of a web of deception. But Caleb wasn't stupid. He wasn't sitting idly by waiting for us to pull the rug out from under him. He had already begun making moves to eliminate anyone who could expose him. That's when things got personal. One afternoon, while I was working with Mark, my old contact from Caleb's team, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, I immediately recognized the voice on the other end. It was Caleb. "You're getting close, David," he said, his tone cold and calculated. "Too close. But here's the thing, you think you can win. You think you can tear down everything I've built. But what you don't understand is that I have everything I need to destroy you. Your allies will turn on you. People you trust will betray you. And when it's all over, you'll be the one left with nothing." I felt the chill of his words sink into me. Caleb was trying to intimidate me, trying to break my resolve. But it didn't work. If anything, it only fueled the fire inside me. I had already lost everything once, and I wasn't about to let him take anything more from me. His threat wasn't empty. That night I received a visit from someone I never expected. Lena, the lawyer who had once been a valuable ally, appeared at my door, looking disheveled and nervous. She had a message for me. Caleb had put a price on my head. She had been paid off, coerced, or perhaps even threatened into betraying me. The world around me seemed to close in. I had trusted Lena, but now she was another pawn in Caleb's game. She was terrified, and she begged for my forgiveness, claiming that she had been forced into it. But the damage had already been done. She had turned on us, providing Caleb with information that would allow him to trap us. Now, I had no choice but to accelerate the plan. Caleb had drawn first blood, and it was time for me to strike back with everything I had. We had gathered enough evidence, and I knew that we couldn't wait any longer. The authorities were beginning to take the investigation seriously, but Caleb was preparing to use his influence to crush any chance we had of bringing him down. I couldn't afford to wait for the perfect moment. The perfect moment was now. It was time to expose Caleb for the monster he was, and make sure that he would never hurt anyone again. The pursuit wasn't just a game anymore, it was life and death, and this time I wasn't going to let Caleb escape. As the days passed, and the walls of Caleb's empire seemed to be closing in on him, something inside me began to shift. The mission that had once been so clear and straightforward now felt heavy, and for the first time, I found myself questioning everything. Was this really the right path? Had I become so consumed by my thirst for revenge that I had lost sight of everything else? Was this war worth the cost? The cost to my soul, to my friends, and to my own humanity? It wasn't just the threats from Caleb or the betrayals from people I had trusted that caused this doubt. No, it was something deeper, something that had been gnawing at me ever since I first began this journey. In my pursuit of justice, or rather my desire for revenge, had I become just like Caleb? Had I allowed myself to be swept up in the very same darkness that had consumed him? I remember the night it all hit me. It was just a few days after Lena's betrayal, and things had gotten more complicated than ever. Caleb had made his move, trying to shake the investigation off, and our group was in a frenzy, scrambling to cover up mistakes, protect ourselves, and move forward. We were getting closer, but at what cost? As I sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the documents before me, evidence photos, bank transfers, phone records, it all started to blur together. The mission had become a blur of names and numbers, of manipulation and deceit, and the faces of those I'd hurt in the process started to appear in my mind. I closed my eyes, trying to push those thoughts away, but the more I tried to ignore them, the more they kept coming. People I had crossed out, people I had used, people I had hurt in my pursuit of this goal. Hannah, once a strong ally, now beginning to doubt our mission. Raphael, his commitment starting to waver, unsure if the blood on our hands would be worth the victory. Even Nina, the lawyer, had started second-guessing herself. They all trusted me, but I had pushed them too far. The toll of revenge was spreading like a cancer among us, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I began to question my own motives. Was I doing this to give the victims justice? Or was I doing it because Caleb had humiliated me, because he had wronged me in ways that no one could understand? Was I fighting to stop a man who would destroy lives? Or was I fighting for my own satisfaction? Had I become a mirror image of Caleb, only with a different target, with different methods? The doubt continued to creep in, and for a moment I thought about walking away. It would have been easy. I could have called off the investigation, could have turned myself in, and walked away from the wreckage of the past few years. But something inside me, that spark of defiance, that sense of justice, told me I couldn't. I couldn't let Caleb get away with what he had done. I couldn't let him keep ruining lives, and I couldn't let him think he had won. Still, the doubt lingered. What would happen after Caleb was taken down? What would I have left? Was revenge truly worth all the sacrifices I had made? And was I prepared to live with the consequences of what I had done? I walked away from the table that night, my mind in turmoil, and I went outside to clear my head. The air was cold, but it was the clarity I needed. I stood there looking up at the stars, wondering how I had come to this point. The journey had started as a way to right the wrongs done to me, to the people I cared about. But now, it had become something else entirely. It had become an obsession, a desire for vengeance that clouded my judgment. As I stood there, a voice in my head reminded me of something I had learned long ago. Revenge is a double-edged sword. It can heal wounds, but it can also create new ones. It can bring justice, but it can also bring destruction. And in the end, it never truly heals the soul. But as the night went on, and the doubts began to fade, I realized something else. I had come too far to turn back now. I couldn't undo the choices I had made, and I couldn't change the past. But what I could do was make sure that Caleb faced justice for what he had done, for the lives he had ruined, for the people he had betrayed. I could do that. The path ahead was still unclear. The consequences of my actions and the actions of those around me would continue to haunt me. But in that moment, I made a choice. I would finish what I had started, and I would see Caleb pay for what he had done. I didn't know what the future would hold, or what I would become in the process. But I knew this: I could no longer allow myself to be a victim of his manipulation. I had to be the one to take control. The pursuit continued, and my resolve hardened. The battle wasn't just about Caleb anymore. It was about something deeper, something that I wasn't sure I could articulate. But it was a battle I had started, and it was one that I had to finish. I could feel the weight of everything on my shoulders, but I knew it was time to push forward. Caleb Foster had made his first move, but now it was my turn. There was no going back. The question wasn't whether or not I would get revenge. It was how much I was willing to lose in the process. The night I spent wrestling with my doubts proved to be a turning point. The following morning, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't afford to let Caleb think he had the upper hand. Every move I made from now on would need to be calculated, precise, and ruthless. I had already come too far to stop now. I had given up too much, lost too much, to let a man like Caleb Foster continue his reign of terror without facing consequences. As I started gathering myself, I realized that my team, the group of people who had joined me in this mission, was beginning to feel the weight of this journey as much as I was. The betrayal, the threats, the loss of trust. It was all starting to take a toll on each one of us, and if I wasn't careful, our unity could fracture at the worst possible time. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon when I got the call. I'd been expecting it, but nothing could have prepared me for the weight of the words I heard. "David, it's happening. We've got him." It was Mark, my old contact from Caleb's team, who had been feeding me information for months. He had just returned from a meeting with a confidential informant who had promised to deliver Caleb's downfall. The time had come. Caleb had underestimated how close we were getting, and now it was time to strike. But as soon as I hung up the phone, the rush of adrenaline I felt quickly gave way to a familiar feeling: fear. Fear of failure. Fear of losing everything. Fear of the consequences of our actions. In that moment, I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was to come. Caleb wasn't just going to roll over. He wasn't going to let this happen without a fight. And as much as I wanted to believe that this was the moment where everything would fall into place deep down, I knew we were entering the final phase of the battle, and there was no turning back now. The turning point didn't come from the information we had gathered or the perfect strategy we had crafted. It came from the realization that in the end, it wasn't just Caleb's empire I was trying to dismantle. It was everything that had led me to this point. My past, my choices, the sacrifices I had made. Every step of this journey had been a response to a man who had wronged me. But in the process, I had unknowingly become part of the same cycle of destruction. It wasn't just about taking Caleb down anymore. It was about breaking free from the chains that bound me to him. The truth was, I had allowed him to define my life for far too long. Every decision I had made, every action I had taken, had been driven by the need to destroy him. But in the end, I wasn't just taking down Caleb Foster. I was taking down the version of myself that had been shaped by him, the version that had been consumed by anger, revenge, and pain. And that's when it hit me. I didn't just need to destroy Caleb's empire. I needed to destroy the anger that had been consuming me all these years. The turning point was never going to be easy. I could still feel the weight of everything I had sacrificed, the people I had hurt, and the choices I had made. But I knew one thing for sure: there was no going back. If I wanted to move forward, if I wanted to truly end this, I had to let go of the anger that had driven me for so long. As I stood there, looking out over the city, I made a promise to myself I would do what needed to be done, but I would also make sure that Caleb's downfall wasn't the end of me. I wasn't just out for revenge anymore. I was out for freedom. Freedom from Caleb. Freedom from the darkness that had defined my life for so long. And I was determined to make sure that no matter what happened next, I would emerge from this fight, not as a victim or a villain, but as a man who had reclaimed his life. The battle was far from over. But as I prepared for the final confrontation, I felt something inside me shift. It was no longer just about taking Caleb down. It was about taking back control of my life. And with that realization, I was ready for what came next. The hours before the confrontation felt like an eternity. I had gathered my team, Nina, Raphael, Hannah, and even Mark, and we were ready to make our move. We had the evidence we needed, the strategies in place, and the element of surprise on our side. Caleb had no idea that we were about to turn the tables on him. It was time to confront him, not just face to face, but with everything we had. The plan was straightforward. We would present the evidence we had to the authorities and the media and expose Caleb for the criminal he was. But there was one thing that kept gnawing at me. Caleb wasn't just a businessman. He was a survivor. He wouldn't go down without a fight, and I knew this would be his final desperate attempt to hang on to everything he had built. This confrontation wasn't just about presenting the truth, it was about survival. I arrived at the meeting location early, a small private office downtown that we had secured for the evening. It was the kind of place that Caleb would never think to look a neutral zone, where we could have a controlled discussion without the prying eyes of his people. The team had already set up, and everything was in place. The evidence was ready to be shown, the authorities were on standby, and all we needed was Caleb to show up. I didn't know what to expect when he walked in. Would he be calm, collected, and willing to negotiate? Or would he be angry, defensive, and desperate? The truth was, I didn't care anymore. I had come this far, and I was ready to see this through. But when he finally walked through the door, I realized just how much I had underestimated him. Caleb didn't walk in with the arrogance I had expected. He didn't have his usual confident smirk or cold smile. Instead, he looked different, more dangerous. His eyes were wild, his movements jittery. He looked like a man who had been pushed to his limits, and that terrified me. "David," Caleb said, his voice low but steady. "I knew you'd come for me, but I never thought it would be like this." There was no anger in his voice, no outburst, just a cold, calculated acceptance. It was as if he had been expecting this moment his entire life, and now that it had arrived, he was ready for it. He wasn't here to beg for mercy. He was here to make his final stand. I stood up slowly, my gaze locked on his. I could feel the tension building in the room as everyone held their breath. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, maybe a show of power, a dramatic reveal of some final card he had up his sleeve. But instead, Caleb simply sat down, looking around the room with a calm that unnerved me. "You think you can destroy me, don't you?" he continued, his eyes narrowing. "You think you've got it all figured out? But let me tell you something, David. I built this empire for a reason. I've always known how to play the game, and I'm not about to lose to you." For a moment, I didn't respond. I just watched him trying to process his words. Caleb had always been good at playing mind games, at twisting the truth to suit his needs. But there was something in his eyes that told me he knew the end was near. He wasn't trying to manipulate me anymore. He was trying to manipulate himself into believing he still had control. "I'm not here to destroy you, Caleb," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm here to make sure you face the consequences of your actions. You don't get to keep hurting people and getting away with it." Caleb chuckled softly, shaking his head as if he found it all amusing. "Consequences," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What consequences, David? The people who tried to bring me down before, they're all gone? Everyone who stood in my way is gone. And you're just another casualty in this war." I felt a surge of anger rise within me, but I kept it in check. He was trying to provoke me to get under my skin, but I had come too far to let that happen now. I wasn't going to let him turn this into another game of manipulation. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about the truth, and it was time to bring it to light. "Everything you've built is built on lies and blood, Caleb," I said, my voice steady. "And it's all coming down. You can't control this anymore. You're not invincible." At that, Caleb's expression faltered for just a moment. It was subtle, but I saw it, the crack in his armor. For the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes. It was as if he realized that the walls he had spent so long building were finally coming down. The fight was over. It was just a matter of when he would accept it. "You think you've won?" Caleb asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You think you've beaten me? This is nothing. You can't take me down. You'll see. You're playing right into my hands." But I wasn't listening anymore. The confrontation had gone from a battle of wits to something more raw, something more personal. I could feel the weight of the evidence we had gathered, the years of pain and suffering Caleb had caused. It was all right here in front of me, and there was nothing he could do to escape it. The law would come for him soon enough, but that wasn't my concern. My job was to ensure that he never had the chance to hurt anyone again. As I stood there watching Caleb's facade crack, I realized something. This wasn't just about destroying Caleb's empire. It was about making sure that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape justice. It was about making sure that the cycle of destruction he had set in motion would end here with him. The authorities burst in moments later, and Caleb's expression turned from defiance to resignation. He didn't resist. He knew it was over. And just like that, everything Caleb had built, everything he had fought for, came crashing down. He was finally going to face the consequences of his actions. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief. As Caleb was escorted out of the room by the authorities, I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the scene unfolding before me. It wasn't the dramatic victory I had imagined. There was no triumphant moment, no sense of elation. It was just a quiet, almost anticlimactic conclusion to a fight that had consumed my life for so long. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Caleb's wrists, I realized something I hadn't won. We had won. The team, the people who had stood by me, had made this possible. And without them, without their sacrifice, none of this would have come to fruition. The media was quick to pick up on the story. Caleb Foster, once a pillar of power, now faced criminal charges that would strip him of everything he had built. The world would know the truth about the man who had used his wealth and influence to destroy lives. The press went into a frenzy, and suddenly I found myself at the center of it all. I had gone from being a man seeking revenge to someone who had become the symbol of justice. But that didn't feel right. I didn't want that. I wasn't here to be a hero. I was here to make sure Caleb never had the chance to hurt anyone again. In the days that followed, the weight of the moment started to sink in. I had spent so long chasing Caleb, so long consumed by the need to take him down, that I hadn't stopped to consider what would come next. I had built this entire plan on the idea that justice would make everything right. But now that it was over, I realized that the damage had already been done. I had lost part of myself in the process. I had hurt people along the way, people I cared about. I had pushed my allies to their limits, forced them into situations they hadn't signed up for. Hannah had risked her career to help me. Nina had been willing to sacrifice her professional reputation for the greater good. Raphael and Mark had put everything on the line, and I had pulled them into a fight that wasn't theirs to begin with. The feeling of victory didn't come as I expected it. Instead of feeling vindicated, I felt empty. The journey had been about so much more than just Caleb. It had been about confronting my own darkness, my own need for control, and the relentless pursuit of justice at any cost. But the truth was no amount of revenge could heal the scars I had accumulated along the way. I sat in the quiet aftermath of Caleb's arrest, reflecting on everything that had led me to this moment. What had I truly gained? Caleb's empire was in ruins. His associates were under investigation, and the trail of evidence we had uncovered would ensure that his name would forever be associated with corruption and violence. But at what cost? As I sat there, I realized that the true victory wasn't in watching Caleb fall. It was in the understanding that I had the power to change, to stop the cycle of revenge and pain. I had fought so hard to take him down, but in the end, I had learned that it wasn't Caleb who needed to be destroyed. It was the part of me that had been consumed by vengeance, the part that had been blinded by rage and hatred. That part of me was gone, and in its place was someone who was ready to rebuild, to make things right with the people I had hurt. The next few weeks were a blur. The media attention surrounding Caleb's arrest was relentless. Everyone wanted to know the story behind his downfall, and suddenly I found myself in the spotlight. But I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to be the face of revenge or justice. I wanted to disappear, to go back to my old life. But I couldn't. The damage had already been done, and there was no escaping the consequences of the decisions I had made. I began to distance myself from the people I had once trusted. Hannah, Nina, and the others had helped me, but they didn't need to be dragged into this any longer. It was time for them to move on. I had done what I set out to do, and now it was time for me to step away from it all. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was necessary. If I didn't break away now, I would lose everything I had left. I couldn't undo the past, but I could try to move forward. The people I had hurt, the people who had been with me through this journey, they deserved a chance at healing, and so did I. In the end, I realized that the most important thing I had gained wasn't revenge, wasn't victory. It was closure. The journey had taught me that vengeance wasn't a path to peace. It was a path that led only to more pain. But through all the chaos, through all the destruction, I had found a way out. I had found a way to let go of the past and take responsibility for my own future. Caleb Foster was in prison, and his empire was gone. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of my own. The question now was, what would I do with the life I had left? The peace I thought I had gained after Caleb's downfall didn't last long. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe, to think about the future and what it might hold for me beyond this dark chapter. But peace, it seemed, was a fleeting illusion. In the aftermath of the investigation, when the dust seemed to settle, I received a call that shattered the fragile calm I had been clinging to. It was Raphael, the man who had been with me from the very beginning, who had helped me navigate through the darkest parts of my plan. Raphael had always been the voice of reason in the chaos, the one who kept things grounded. But this time, his voice was shaky, anxious, and filled with the kind of tension I hadn't heard from him before. "David," he said, his words rushed and disjointed. "You need to listen to me. Something's happening. It's about Nina." Nina. She was one of the few people I had trusted completely, and the last thing I expected was for her to be caught in something that could unravel everything we had worked for. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tight with concern. Caleb didn't go down as easily as we thought, Raphael replied, his voice low, filled with the weight of a terrible revelation. He's been in contact with Nina. She's been working with him. She's been feeding him information. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Nina, the woman who had helped me so much, who had risked everything for this fight, was now the one I had to fear the most. The betrayal was more than just a twist in the plot. It felt personal. I had trusted Nina. I had believed in her. And now I realized I had been blind to the possibility that she might have her own agenda. No, I said firmly, disbelief flooding my mind. That doesn't make sense. Nina was with us every step of the way. She wouldn't do this. Raphael hesitated, the silence on the other end of the line, hanging like a dark cloud. I thought the same. But I've seen the evidence. Caleb's lawyers have been working with her. She's been leaking details, trying to protect herself, or maybe trying to make a deal with Caleb's people. I don't know what she's involved in, but she's not the person we thought she was. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. Nina had been a linchpin in our plan, someone whose legal expertise had been invaluable in gathering the evidence we needed to bring Caleb down. But now it was clear that something had changed. And it wasn't just about money or power, it was something darker, something I couldn't yet understand. I needed to confront Nina. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. If she was working with Caleb, then everything we had done, everything I had sacrificed, would have been for nothing. And if I couldn't trust Nina, then who could I trust? The confrontation came quickly. I tracked Nina down to her apartment, a place I had been to many times before. When I knocked on the door, I wasn't sure what I would find. Would she admit to what she had done? Would she try to deny it, lie to me like Aaron had done before? Or would she be as cold as Caleb, pretending nothing was wrong? When she opened the door, the look in her eyes was enough to tell me everything. There was a kind of guilt in her gaze, a kind of resignation. And for the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about survival. Nina had been trying to save herself, and in the process, she had crossed a line. "David," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen." I stepped inside, not waiting for an invitation. "How long?" I asked, my voice hard, colder than I had ever heard it before. "How long have you been working with Caleb?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a brief moment I almost believed her. But then she spoke, and the truth I had been dreading came pouring out. "I was trying to protect us," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to betray you, but when I saw how far Caleb was willing to go, how much power he still had, I knew I had to make a choice. He offered me protection, a way out, and I thought it was the only way to survive." The words were like a slap to the face. Nina had known what Caleb was capable of, and yet instead of continuing to fight with us, she had chosen to side with him. She had chosen self-preservation over loyalty, and in doing so, she had turned everything we had worked for into a lie. "You chose him over us?" I asked, my voice cold. After everything we did," she lowered her head, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her guilt. "I didn't know what else to do, David. I was scared. Caleb, he's powerful. He promised me that if I helped him, he would make sure I was safe. I didn't know how far you were willing to go, how far you had already gone." I didn't wait for her to finish. There were no more words to say. I had trusted Nina, and she had chosen her side. She had betrayed me, betrayed all of us. I should have seen it, I said, more to myself than to her. "You were never really with us. You were always looking for a way out, and now you've made your choice." I turned and walked out of her apartment without another word. I didn't need to hear any more excuses. Nina had made her decision, and now I had to deal with the fallout. It wasn't just about Caleb anymore. The real enemy was not just the man I had sought revenge on, but the people who had betrayed me along the way. Nina's betrayal was the final nail in the coffin. It was a stark reminder that no one could be trusted completely, and that in the end, we were all just pawns in a much larger game. With Nina's betrayal weighing heavily on my heart, I knew that my mission wasn't over yet. The final reckoning was still to come, and Caleb, even in prison, was still a danger. I couldn't stop now. I had already lost too much to let this be the end. The weight of Nina's betrayal settled heavily on my chest, but there was no time for hesitation. The plan had always been clear. Caleb Foster had to pay for his actions. The group I had gathered, my allies who had stuck by me through it all, was falling apart. Every time I turned around, there was another betrayal, another twist that made me question everything. But I couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now. Not when we were this close. Nina was out of the picture. She had made her choice, and I couldn't let her derail the mission. But now the question lingered. Could I really finish this without being consumed by the same darkness that had driven Caleb? Could I truly step away from the revenge that had been the only thing keeping me going? The line between justice and vengeance had blurred long ago, and it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. It had been a few weeks since Nina's betrayal, and now Caleb was preparing for his final showdown. Even though he was behind bars, I knew that his influence wasn't gone. He still had people working for him, people who were willing to go to extreme lengths to protect his empire. But we were prepared. The authorities had been gathering evidence, and I had given them everything I had. I wasn't looking for credit or recognition. I didn't want to be a hero. I just wanted Caleb to face the consequences of his crimes. But something inside me told me that wasn't going to be enough. Caleb wasn't the type to go down without a fight. I couldn't leave anything to chance. It all came to a head when I received a message that Caleb was being transferred to a high-security facility. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Caleb would be locked away, and his power would be diminished. But I knew this wasn't just about him being put behind bars. This was about making sure he couldn't hurt anyone ever again. I knew Caleb would try something. He always did. So I took matters into my own hands. The plan was simple: intercept the transfer, get the last piece of evidence we needed, and make sure that Caleb's downfall was irreversible. I was done playing games. It was time to end this for good. As I arrived at the high-security facility where Caleb was being held, I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline flood my veins. This was it, the final confrontation. But unlike the confrontations of the past, I wasn't here for justice alone. I was here to make sure Caleb didn't have a chance to escape. Not now. Not ever. I met with Mark, the last ally I trusted, the man who had once worked for Caleb. Together, we put the plan into motion. The authorities had already been briefed, and the evidence was solid. But there was one thing we still needed: a final confession from Caleb himself. The kind of confession that would ensure no lawyer, no amount of money could save him. As the convoy carrying Caleb pulled into the facility, I felt the tension in the air. Every step I took, every movement made was calculated. We had to make this quick, and we had to make it clean. Caleb was surrounded by guards, but I had anticipated that. We weren't going to take him by force. We were going to make him give us what we needed. I waited as Caleb was escorted from the vehicle to the facility's holding area. The moment was now or never. I approached the area where he was being held, and as I stepped into the room, our eyes met. Caleb didn't seem surprised to see me. If anything, he looked almost relieved, as if he had been expecting me all along. "You've come a long way, David," Caleb said, his voice cold, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But you're too late. You can't stop what's already been set in motion. I'll be free soon enough." I could see the fear behind his eyes, the realization that his empire was truly crumbling. But he wasn't going to give up without a fight. He was still trying to control the narrative to manipulate the situation. But I wasn't buying it anymore. "I'm not here to stop you from going to prison, Caleb," I said, my voice calm but firm. I'm here to make sure you never get out. Caleb's smirk faltered just for a moment, and that was enough. I could see the panic in his eyes as I laid out the evidence in front of him. The documents, the recordings, the confession from his own associates. The trail of destruction he had left behind was too vast to ignore. He had been caught, and now there was no way out. You thought you could control everything, didn't you? I continued stepping closer to him. But this time, Caleb, you're the one who's trapped. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone you've hurt. He was silent for a long moment, staring at the evidence in front of him. Then with a resigned sigh, he spoke again, but this time his voice was different. There was no bravado, no arrogance. There was only fear. You think this is over? Caleb whispered, his eyes narrowing. You're wrong. I'll find a way out. People like me always do. But I wasn't listening anymore. Caleb's words meant nothing. They were just the last desperate attempts of a man who had lost everything. I had won. He was going to pay for his crimes, and no one was going to stop it. As the authorities moved in to take him into custody, I felt a strange sense of finality. The battle was over, but the war inside me was just beginning. The last thing I needed to do now was face the reality of what this had all meant. I had spent years chasing Caleb, but in the end, it was never about him. It was about me, about finding peace with the darkness I had let consume me. Caleb Foster would never hurt anyone again, but I still had a long road ahead of me. I wasn't sure who I was anymore, but one thing was clear: I wasn't the same man who had started this journey. I had taken down a monster. Now it was time to rebuild.